I want to take you on a journey. I hope you want to come with me, both in time and geography. Okay? And part of this Wayback Machine is you can pause it at any point by raising your hand, which I'm hoping you will, and say, hey, wait a minute, and ask a question. Because as my grown children have told me for years, I tend to drone on, and I'll bore you to death. So please, this is interactive. But Linda's exactly right. What we're going to talk about today is actually right where we are physically in this geography is where enslavement in New Jersey, in this part of our state, began. And that's startling to understand, at least for me, who grew up down here too in Middletown. And I didn't know that till, I don't know, 5 or 8 years ago. So you'll see some of that. And that's a cover of the book that I put out a couple years ago. The man on the right there was born enslaved in Middletown, New Jersey, in 1820. His name is Charles Reeves. The woman on the left may or may not have been an enslaved woman. That's an image that I got from the Monmouth County Historic Association. There's no attribution, so they really don't know. But the pose is typical of what people would do for either servants or enslaved people. But that said, let's see if this works. Oh, good. So, Monday is Juneteenth, right? And some of you know, and I didn't know until the last several years what Juneteenth was and its significance. So just a brief talk about that. Here's the audience participation card, and you get an A if you get these answers right. Okay. What year was the Emancipation Proclamation?
63.
63.
Hey! You get an extra brownie. Anyway, that's right. In 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln declares and writes the Emancipation Proclamation. And this gentleman knows, but it did not free all the enslaved folks. It only, and it was a political consideration, freed the enslaved in the states of rebellion. Okay? And you don't need any fingers to count the number of slaves that were freed by Southern people who owned them. The answer is 0. They didn't do it. Okay? So that was a really good thing, but it didn't take effect. But Lincoln did it for a lot of reasons. But it gave him a legal framework to, as the Northern troops went down south and freed people, that the enslaved people could run away to what they called the Lincoln soldiers. Okay, and now they had protection, as opposed to how the Southern, and you'll see today, even people up here, looked at enslaved people as property. Okay, and one of the things Lincoln was concerned about was, well, after the war, if we win, fine. If we lose, what if people want to claim their property people back? So we had a legal framework here. In any event, so that happened, but not everybody got the word. You know, you can imagine that folks down south who owned enslaved people are not going to tell them that the Emancipation Proclamation happens. So anyway, the war's over by 1865. You already know Lincoln gets assassinated in April that year. But it took until June when this man, okay, General Granger, showed up in Galveston, Texas, and announced to those enslaved people, hey, you're free now. They had no idea, okay? As did probably a lot of other black folks in the South who were not informed by the people who owned them. So, as you, I think, know, Juneteenth celebrates that, and it surprised me, actually, but not all black communities grew up celebrating Juneteenth, okay? I don't know, where's my friend? Did your family celebrate it? Right. You know, I was talking to a woman the other day who grew up in Harlem, and she said, we didn't celebrate it. So it depends on where you were. And now, luckily, for all of us, and you know, by the way, it's 19th in June, that's where the term comes from. Luckily, President Biden, a couple of years ago, signed into law that it is now a national Independence Day, right? Not national holiday, sorry. So that's really great. As is Martin Luther King Day, and all these things that are changing that are reflective of what I hope all of you believe, right? That it's past time for this to have happened. Okay, so that's Juneteenth. I'm sure you've read a lot about that lately. That may startle you, okay? Because New Jersey was known as the Georgia of the North. Not something to be especially proud of, because we were the last northern state to agree to ratify the 13th Amendment. It's really disgraceful. So by December of 1865, after the Civil War is over, the 13th Amendment is ratified by the number of states, 3/4 of the then existing states. So it's going to happen. And New Jersey dragged its feet, our legislature dragged its feet until January of '66, and we said basically, oh, okay, we'll go along with this. And you think, wow, how could that possibly be? This is New Jersey, right? Well, I'm going to hopefully show you how some of that came about. And already you know how important where we are sitting in this property, these hundreds and hundreds of acres around here, were to the story. So let's go back in time, and again, stop me where you want. So you might know that 1609, right, Henry Hudson shows up, right, and he anchors off Sandy Hook, and that's the first recorded contact between Native Americans and Europeans. And by recorded, I mean there were there were surely other incidences of people coming over here from Europe and, meeting Native folks, but he gets the credit for whatever reason. So as a result of that, Dutch lay claim, he was English by the way, but he's working for the Dutch government. The Dutch lay claim to this part of the New World. The English had, no surprise, New England, and they had Virginia, okay? But in the middle, kind of the middle states today, the Dutch took over. So they took over what is now New Jersey, most of Long Island, New York, all the way up to Albany, a little bit of Pennsylvania, and down into what's now Delaware. And so they held on to it for, the better part of 40 years, until the English, who were very annoyed that in the middle of their two colonial outposts, they had these Dutch. And the English and Dutch were always fighting in Europe over all kinds of things. So in August of 64, 65, it's a double date year because of two different calendars at that time. The English come into New York Harbor, and they tell Peter Stuyvesant, whose name I know you know, either surrender or we're going to bombard your town, and he surrenders and the shot's not fired. And the English take over all of this, okay? And there's old Peg-Leg, as I like to call him. I guess you probably shouldn't say that anymore, but I do anyway. So there it is, there's 4 English ships in the back, okay, in this obviously much later image, and he gives up all of the territory to a fleet commanded by this guy named Richard Nichols, who sent over here from England. Okay, and then immediately they rename New Amsterdam, downtown New York today, New York, after the Duke of York, who is the sponsor of this expedition, and also the founder of the Hair Club for Men. Never fails. Anyway, so he becomes king later. We'll talk about that. Okay. So as part of and this is important to what we're getting to, as part of the Dutch surrender, and there's the Dutch surrender document that the English make them sign, is a couple of things. The English, like most of the European states in those days, were interested in colonies as a way to generate money. Okay, that's simple enough. But because the Dutch had introduced slavery into New Jersey, New York, by taking up a lot of enslaved folks, not so much directly from Africa, but from the Caribbean, where all the islands had been taken over by European powers. The English recognized that, and in the Articles of Capitulation, so-called, they said to the Dutch who were still living here and in New York, it's okay, we're not going to upset the apple cart here, you can continue to own your slaves. And they did that because they wanted to gain the allegiance of these very rich, most of them Dutch people who had been colonizing New York and New Jersey. And as always in American history at least, the profit motive was more important to people than any allegiance to the flag. So the Dutch slaveholders, of which there were many in New York City and what is now Bergen County, okay, all go along and say, yeah, sure, this is great, thanks. And it was what it was. And the signers of this blow-up of that document is a mix of English and Dutch people. That's Richard Nichols. But one guy here we're going to talk about who is very instrumental in what happened at Pit Falls is Cornelius Steenwyck, obviously a Dutch name. He's a really, really wealthy slave holder in New York City. He later becomes mayor of New York. So he makes an easy transition from the Dutch loyalty to the English. He doesn't care. It's all about money. Reverberates today, doesn't it? Okay. And then within a few years, downtown in what's now New York City, of course, there's an active slave market where people are bringing in slaves from mostly the Caribbean, later on a little bit directly from Africa. And thus it begins. The Dutch had started this horrid practice in New York and New Jersey, and now the English take over, and the Lords Proprietors, you know these two guys, right? Berkeley and Carteret before they became hoteliers. That's one of our original documents where they were given also by the Duke of York, New Jersey, and they split it, East and West Jersey. We're clearly in East Jersey, right? And they never came here. They were land speculators. They got rewarded for their loyalty during the English Civil Wars by the Duke of York because they supported the Royalists as opposed to the Parliamentarians and all that. And so they get this huge land grant and they go, great, let's split it up and we'll sell pieces of it and we'll become rich. But what they do that's interesting and shocking at the same time is they both issue what are called concessions and agreements, basically a charter to the people who they are trying to encourage to come here, right? More colonists. And here's an excerpt from it, and I'll read it for you. But they're talking about New Caesarea. Did you ever hear of New Caesarea? No. Okay. So I want you to hear the phonetics, and this is going to be great when you get. Are you out of school or are you going back Monday or Tuesday?
Going back Tuesday. That's the last day.
Too bad. What next year when you get history? You can wow your classmates with what I'm about to say. I hope.
I want to forget.
Anyway, New Jersey is named after Julius Caesar. Did you know that? Okay, let me tell you how that happened. Okay, think of it phonetically. Jersey and Chazar. New Jersey is named after the Isle of Jersey in the English Channel, which in the Roman times was named after Julius Caesar. So we are the state of New Caesar. Okay? Yeah. That'll help you on the next time you play trivia. Okay. So in this document, the concessions and agreements, they're talking about us, and here's what it says. Okay? To every free man, again, these proprietors are trying to lure English colonists to come over here. For every free man, English white man, okay, you're going to be given 150 acres of land. That's a nice incentive. You know, England's crowded in the 17th century. Okay, so you come over here to this new land that everybody's known about, and they're reading pamphlets about, and so that's kind of nice. Except that they added this part. And for every weaker servant or slave that you bring, male or female, exceeding the age of 14, which one shall send or carry here, you'll get another 75 acres of land. So what that means is slavery is baked into our founding documents. Ouch. Why? Why would anybody have an idea? Why would they do that?
They bought property, I guess.
Yeah, money, of course, but why would they specifically call to bring over enslaved people? Well, for a couple of reasons. That guy, again, the Duke of York, in 1660 had started a company, a private company called the Royal African Company. The sole purpose of which was to take English ships down the coast of Africa, trade for African enslaved people from other Africans, and bring them to the New World. And he's the principal stockholder, and so since he rewarded his two proprietor friends here for supporting during the war, they're in turn, this crazy circular logic, rewarding him by encouraging enslaved people to come over with these new colonists, and the Royal African Company is going to sell slaves to these people. Yuck, right? That's how it begins from the English standpoint. And by the way, not just in New Jersey, every one of what becomes the original 13 American colonies were slaveholding states. Every one. So if you're like me and grew up watching Gone with the Wind and all that kind of nonsense, you thought the bad people were all down south. Well, we had our own share of bad. Okay, and I know that's a judgment, but come on, you can't hold some of this. Okay, so that's why this starts. And you know about the triangular trade, right? Not just England, but Europe. Finished goods are going down the coast of Africa. Whoops, sorry. And they're trading with African, I'm going to use a word that's silly, but chiefs, right? People that are in charge of other people who are now selling enslaved people that they captured in little battles and whatnot. And they're trading for these goods they want, firearms, cloths, salt, things that the Africans want to produce. And then in turn, the slave ships are going across what's called the notorious Middle Passage. At first to the West Indies, the enslaved people are put on tobacco farms, later sugar plantations to work, and the money generated by that through rum and sugar and all that kind of stuff goes back on other ships to Europe. And so you have what has been called the triangular trade. And people are making fortunes beyond belief. And you can still read, you will still read, seems like every week or so in the paper, or you see on the news, they're still finding out that a lot of, especially in England, a lot of family fortunes were built on the backs of slaves, literally. Okay, and we're going to talk about one particular place. Nobody's interrupting you, come on. Okay, so Wales. Wales is this part of England, right? Anybody been there? Okay, I think it's pretty cool. I mean, it's very cool. Anyway, so Wales is a section of England to the west, as you see, and it turns out that there's a couple of brothers whose families from there called Lewis Morris and Richard Morris, and they're from a place called Tintern. See it? Okay, and also that's located in Monmouthshire. This is a smart crowd. And it looks like that. I've been to Wales, but I don't remember being here. But anyway, obviously it's beautiful. And you could still go today to the ruins of Tintern Abbey, which does look quite like it did. So these kind of brothers get involved in a lot of stuff early in life, and they wind up in the Caribbean, to short circuit it, in a place called Barbados. Anybody been to Barbados? Yes. Beautiful. Anybody got relatives in Barbados? You've been though, right? Okay. Do you have any 151 rum at home we can all share? I always ask and nobody ever takes me up. Anyway, Barbados is like all the islands of the Caribbean get taken over by European powers. All right, and they completely ignore the native folks there, as always. They die off or they get killed, and Barbados becomes one of the principal holdings of the English in the mid-17th century. And there it is, and you can't see it, so you'll have to trust me here. This says the 10,000 acres of lands which belongeth to the merchants of London. So there were conglomerations, little companies put together by rich people in London, and they would buy up hundreds and thousands of acres and start originally with tobacco plantations, because you get multiple growing seasons, right, in the Caribbean. And then they switched to sugar, and sugar in those days is like a precious commodity, and they blanket the island with sugarcane fields. And where they're sitting, these are two Dutch Quaker slaveholders. I should say English Quaker slaveholders. So, contrary to what we all believed for most of our lives, Quakers in the early days were not abolitionists. They were the people here, especially in Barbados, they were business people, and they came like everybody else with the profit motive, and they owned enslaved people. And that continues in Monmouth County, by the way, well into the 18th century. There are wills I could show you where Quakers free their aged enslaved people, because they're basically used up, but they pass the younger, more vital people down to their project. Quakers. Okay, so anyway, these are two Quaker people, and you might be able to see there's enslaved people in the back. This is a very famous image that's been copied a lot, and it says there are tobacco farmers here and plantation owners in Barbados. Okay? And Richard and Lewis Morris wind up there, down in this part of the area. They own multiple plantations, and they get fabulously wealthy real quickly, again, because they buy enslaved people, and that's who's doing the hard work. And you can't see it, but up here, there are 2 runaway slaves, and a guy on horseback, presumably a white Englishman, chased them and fired a musket at them. Because slaves were always running away, as they should, right? Anyway, as part of that, and that's why we're here today, Lewis Morris acquires, okay, an enslaved boy, he's a young kid at the time, called Yaf, which I've talked to people at Monmouth University. It's an African-sounding name. We're not quite sure where it's from, but it's certainly not an ordinary English name. Okay, and he becomes his personal servant. So I don't know that Yaf worked in the fields or not, and suddenly got plucked out because Lewis Morris saw something of him. I suspect not. I suspect that he showed a lot of promise. You'll find out he was a really, really bright guy in his own right, and I think Lewis Morris recognized that and brings him into the house, let's say, to be his personal attendant, and he stays with him the rest of Lewis Morris's life. Okay, here, yeah, that's that thing I wanted to point out. Okay, and there is another guy. That's Sir William Penn, or I should say Admiral Sir William Penn, the father of the guy you know. Okay, same name. Plays a very important role in the story because Lewis Morris, when he's in the Caribbean and they're playing out the English Civil War in the Caribbean, Lewis Morris works under him, and so they become friends. And that has a lot of implications for what happens in the future. And by the way, Quaker, the Society of Friends only begins around 1647 in England. Okay, George Fox gets credit as the founder, but he was one of many actually. And they visit, Quaker missionaries visit Barbados because they're always looking to proselytize and convert people. And Lewis Morris is one of the people they visit when he's in Barbados, and he becomes what Quakers call convinced that the truth of the Society of Friends is the real truth. Most of these folks you would imagine were Church of England, okay? And Quakers, which I am not, but whom I admire greatly, their belief is that we don't need all the ceremony and all the idolatry of organized Christian religion, that we all have the truth in us. If we listen, we can hear directly from God. And so there's no conversion as such, but you become convinced when you listen to these preachers. And Lewis Morris becomes a Quaker when he's in Barbados. And, you know, horrible stuff. There's millions of images, and I've seen this when I've been in the Caribbean in certain islands. They would put up oxen and horse to grind, raw sugar cane, and from that you can extract sugar and you can make rum and molasses and all kinds of things. And in this image, of course, the white people are all around and the enslaved people are doing all the work. That's not a surprise to us now. Okay, so what happens? So the Morris brothers make a ton of money, and then they start looking north up here. And the first thing they do, this is a rough image of Manhattan, New York City down there at the point. This is what is called the Bronx now. Okay, by the way, that's named after a Swede who owned it called Jonas Bronk. Becomes the Bronx. And so the Morris brothers buy, this says Morris Plantation. They buy a chunk of land up there in 1670, about 500 acres. And then Lewis Morris, his brother Richard takes over that. Lewis Morris has a house downtown Manhattan, and he commutes back and forth to Barbados to look over the plantations and all that kind of stuff. By the way, plantation is not a southern word, okay? Anytime that the English came over here to the New World and planted, they call that a plantation. So we're on a plantation. Okay. Anyway, today, if you go to New York City, and this is a more contemporary map, that section of the Bronx is still called Morrisania. Because immodestly, they call their estate Morrisania after themselves, right? You can do that if you have enough money. Okay, downtown in what is now New York, formerly New Amsterdam, right here, this guy, that's Cornelius Steenwick, that I told you about, who's really rich, slave holding, and becomes mayor of New York later on. His neighbor, right next door, is Lewis Morris. Lewis Morris has a house, so they become friends. They're business people, they're contemporaries. Obviously Morris is English and Steenwyck is Dutch. And it turns out, here's where we're getting local now. In 1674, Steenwyck lends a huge amount of money, 100 pounds of English currency then, to James Grover of Middletown, New Jersey. You know the Grover House, maybe? Malpit Hall was built by his grandson, I believe. But the Grovers were one of the very first settlers in Middletown, and Monmouth County for that matter. So somehow Grover knows Steenwyck in New York. He borrows 100 pounds so that he can operate land here as an iron mill at a place they call the Falls. Look to your right. It's right there. Okay, and here's the original mortgage document that they signed. And so what happens is Lewis Morris sees an opportunity. He's friends with Steenwyck, and he says, hey, you know, let me in on the good news here. And so he buys into the mortgage. Basically, he takes over the mortgage, which is half of what James Grover and two other guys have invested in. And then pretty quickly, Morris buys them out. Okay, so right here in, I think it's 1680, there's a map, and here's Sandy Hook, so north is this way. This says Colonel Morris, his ironworks. All right, so let's see what we're talking about. So this soil here has iron rich, everybody knows, right, all red soil in a lot of places. And so when vegetation, like we're seeing now, grows and then deteriorates in the fall over many, many years because it's absorbed iron from the soil, there's a process by which you can extract iron. And that's why we're here, okay? Because the concept that Grover had was, oh, I'm gonna get rich, okay, by extracting iron. Iron is unbelievably valuable. It's expensive to ship finished iron goods from Europe. It's heavy, so it costs a lot. If you can produce iron here in the colonies, all the better, and you can make a lot of money. And so Grover and these two other guys, right, Applegate and Hartshorn, you know those names, they try this, and they're not doing real well, right here, okay? They can't figure it out. They hire a couple of brothers named Leonard from the Salvus, Massachusetts ironwork. The Leonards come down here, Leonardville, that's that family, okay? And the Leonards try to help them out, and they're still not doing all that great. So in comes Lewis Morris, he takes over, and he's gonna make this a success. And let's see how he does that. Okay, so again, here's the Morris plantations, and it's genius for the time when you think about it. Up here is Morrisania in the Bronx. There's Manhattan, Staten Island, and down here is, it says actually, the Shrewsbury Iron Mill. We were all part of Shrewsbury at the time. Okay, and so what's happening is stuff that Lewis Morris is producing here with slaves, okay, he's producing and sending up by ships all the way up the Hudson River eventually to his brother, or he's stopping downtown New York and selling stuff. And what is the stuff? Well, it starts out as iron, but then because they start out with 3,600 acres, they have the slaves starting to farm, okay? And they're producing grain, and they're grinding it. And so this is completely lucrative, so that these products can come up to New York, which is starting to become a really, really famous place, and they're making even more money. It's all about following the money. Okay, so in January I went to England, purposely to find out about stuff. And this is totally serendipitous. I go to the friend's house, the Quaker house, and I couldn't have planned this. It happened to be 2 blocks from the hotel I was staying in. And I thought, oh, I'll look for stuff, you know. And I'm talking to one of the archivists there, and she said, oh, wait a minute, here's a list of letters, and I see Lewis Morris, and that's a picture I took of a letter from the Lewis Morris in 1675, the original letter, right? It's really kind of cool. And the reason that's important is, and I'll read it to you, the excerpt says, and this is his spelling, I am almost ready to go on board for New York, so I am in a great hash. And I'm like, it's not eating breakfast, what is he talking about? Okay. So that phraseology means he's all in a flutter, right? He's got so many things going. But it turns out that he's in Barbados when he's writing this letter, and he mentions some pretty prominent Quaker folks in the letter, because by then he's a Quaker. This is the voyage where he puts 60 to 70 enslaved people from his Barbadian plantations to come up here. Some go to his brother's plantation, Morrisania, in the Bronx, and the rest of them are here.
1675?
1675. That's how early this is. Now, again, remember, the Dutch have had slaves in Bergen County in New York since the 1620s, but this is where it gets hold down here, because Monmouth County is basically empty. You know, you got Middletown just starting up Kings Highway, that's the original Middletown village, okay? But this is where it begins, okay, for our purposes. And among that group is Yaf. And just so you know, it's hard to see, I corrected the map. This is north. This property here is all that Lewis Morris owns. Here's the Swimming River, right? Here's Tinton Manor. Maybe not here, but across the street or wherever, right on this property. The Pine Brook, right here. I'm gonna throw my car into it today because I've got to put it in park when I'm parked. But anyway, and so here's Tinton Falls on this map, which you can't see that well. Okay, and even though it looks like that today, okay, Linda, did you promise to take us all over to,
No, we can do better than that, though.
oh, we can?
Well.
We have a surprise, don't we?
Sweet potato pie.
Ooh. Ooh.
Yeah.
Okay. In any
We've
event.
got about 10 minutes to wrap it up, Ricky.
No, but no problem. Okay, the reason it's there is the falls was 20 foot high at one point. Okay, and you need water power to run mills so you can grind grain and cut timber and all kinds of stuff. That's why he's here. And right there, out there in the back, as you know, is where archaeologists believe is probably where the enslaved were buried without markings, or if they had markings, they were long gone.
Do you know what would happen environmentally to make the falls not 20 feet high anymore?
Yeah, a couple of things. Erosion over time.
Okay.
And then there's been a lot of construction here that is not as visible today as you might know. Okay, I'm going to try to speed up here. Lewis Morris dies in 1691, and in his will he says he's going to give £5 to the Shrewsbury Quakers. Okay, and then here it is. He mentions the Tin Ironworks. He says, "I give and bequeath unto my honored friend William Penn, my Negro man Yaf, provided said Penn shall come to dwell in America." Ow! And there's a whole bunch of other enslaved people here that he gives away to people. Yes, that William Penn, the son of the admiral, the great Quaker that everybody thinks is benevolent and all that, yes, it's all true, but he was a slaveholder too, and not just Yaf. And in this will of Lewis Morris, we have any number of other enslaved people named. And you start to see they're starting to get English names. They're being told what their names are. Okay, and why are they there? Because they're doing work on what was probably across the street somewhere, long gone. They're transporting this material from the Pine Brook, and there's a process where you can make iron, and it's labor intensive, and God knows white people are not going to do it, right? So the slaves are planting all kinds of products around here. They are developing a lot of skills. This is one of the things that not nobody, but few people get acknowledged for. Slaves did a lot of stuff, okay, besides farming, and they're acquiring all kinds of skills, okay? So we need to acknowledge that. They're also with the grist mill. They're turning, flour and stuff into grains, I should say, into flour. They're the ones that are going into the woods, chopping all the wood down so they can make charcoal for the furnaces, and they're in a sawmill. So they're doing basically with white overseers all the work, all right? And he starts with maybe 60, but through a couple of processes, obviously natural, they're getting more and more slaves. Okay, when we look at Lewis Morris's inventory, after he dies, people come in, they inventory, and you see carts and timber wheels and all kinds of stuff. Way down at the bottom, you see after 14 pages, Negroes. And he's got, at the time of his death, right here, including Yaf, 66 enslaved people, worth 844 pounds. Doesn't sound like a lot, right? Except when you translate it, it's about $2.5 million. That's just the enslaved people. He's a multimillionaire. He's the richest guy in East Jersey by far, is Lewis Morris, Shrewsbury Iron Mill there. And he's also got over almost 60% of all the enslaved people in East Jersey. That's how important where we're sitting is. Okay, William Penn, what does he do? You know, he comes over to America at one point, okay? Did you know that he owned New Jersey? With a group of other men. First he buys West Jersey, then he buys East Jersey again. He's a speculator, he wants to sell land. He founds Philadelphia in 1682. He builds with slave labor up here, and you can still go to it, Pennsbury Manor. Okay, anybody been there? They've done a pretty good job about acknowledging their enslaved folks. That makes him that. And then he returns to England, which is why in the will of Lewis Morris, he's trying to lure him back. And he says, here, I'll give you this enslaved person. Okay, so Penn does come back, and he acquires Yaffe from another Lewis Morris, the nephew, same name, of the guy that just died. And then Penn sails to London in 1703 with Yaffe. I'll show you how we know that. Because London's this virgin metropolis, of course. And the way we know that is we have a letter that Penn writes in April 1703 to that guy, James Logan, his secretary in Philadelphia. And in this letter, William Penn says, Yaffe is also gone. And he says, I have resolved that after 4 years of faithful service that he shall be free, but I've left it for him to return. And then he says, he's down in Deal. Our Deal is named after that Deal in England. And that Deal, here's the Thames, there's London, and Deal is in Kent, down in that part. Where's my English friend? Do I have it right? Anyway, and it looked like that. And when I was in England, I went down to Deal, and I met these wonderful women at their historic society who opened up the place in January when it was closed and gave us all kinds of information. Deal is there was important because when you'd come over from America or anywhere else for that matter, you'd stop overnight in Deal in your ship because it's a natural harbor, and then you go up the Thames or the reverse, whatever you do. Okay, and our Deal here was named by a guy from Kent named Thomas White. That's how that all came. Okay, so here's where we know that Yaffe is this really clever guy. In the letter, Penn says he's an able planter, he's a good husbandman, and he promises fair. So we know that Yaffe over the years, what does he do? He's got to learn English. He's meeting all these famous people, William Penn, Lewis Morris, what's his name here, James Logan, and others, because he's always at basically Lewis Morris's side. And he's got all these skills. So when I went to Deal, and that's kind of what that whole thing left, I walked the streets literally trying as best I could to say, because there's no contemporary records of Yaffe there. So let me pause for a second. Do you think, because William Penn promised Yaffe his return passage here, do you think he would come back here? Why not?
Well, he's
He was enslaved here.
Yes.
That's not going to look too good for him, okay? Unless, and we don't have any records, unless he had a family. There's no record of that. He might have, and that would have been a strong draw. So I think he stayed there. I'm sure he had manumission papers, whatever they called them in those days, from William Penn saying he's free. Maybe he also has a letter of recommendation from Penn, who everybody knows. And I think he's about 55 then. I think he probably settles in England somewhere. And where, we don't know. In any event, I walk the streets. Here, this is the boardwalk in Deal. It's pebbles.
Yeah.
It's not like our city, okay? I went to that castle, which was built by Henry VIII to guard the southern coast of England. There's a ton of them there. And this is not remarkably different, that's the seafront village of Deal. Have you been there too? Not recently. Anyway, it's a tourist town now, mainly. I was there in January, so it's cool. And here's an old image they showed me of a street called Middle Street in town. And I took that picture, and you can see, this is 300 years ago, and they've done a remarkable job of preserving their heritage. So I walked those streets, and I was trying to think, what's Yaffe thinking? And I'm thinking, and I don't know this, but he's going, I'm not going back to that place. That wasn't fun. But I've got a lot of skills. he's obviously well-versed in English and diplomacy, for lack of a better word, right? He's dealing with some pretty high-powered people. So he can make a living, maybe not in Deal, but in England. And I think maybe he does that, and maybe he settles down, maybe he takes a wife and kids. I mean, I don't know that. But it's interesting that he's there. Last we lose. And then there's some ironies. So when I was there, I noticed when they were walking on the waterfront, the Admiral Penn hotel, basically, right? And I thought, oh, I know what that is. But if you go down a little bit, down Market Street, right there, down Market Street, around the corner from the Admiral Penn, is where a Quaker meeting house was. Admiral Penn hated the fact that William Penn, his son, became a Quaker. He was staunch Church of England. They had monumental battles about this. Okay, that's a whole other interesting topic. But I thought that was kind of a cool irony. And there they are, they had this argument, and William Penn is disgraced and later jailed, by the way. Okay, so I want to just kind of finish up here. The travels of Yaf. This is an amazing story. So here's a representation. We don't know this, but in what is Senegal and Gambia, Senegambia they call it, it sounds like, I talked to somebody who said, the name sounds like it may be from there, who knows? So he may have been born there, or his parents were born there, and then they came to Barbados, we're not sure. And his name may be a variation of Yusuf or Yassif or whatever. White people called enslaved people whatever they wanted, obviously. Okay, and so somewhere around 1647 to 50, he winds up, we know Yaf is in Barbados. He stays there for the better part of 50 years or so. 1675, we know he comes up here to Tinton Falls, eventually with Lewis Morris. Stays here for the better part of 20 years. Between here and New York, they're always going back and forth. And then around 1703, according to that letter, he goes to Deal. And then we lose track of Yaf. Okay, but again, I gotta believe, and the fact that they mention him in the letter is he promises fair. He's probably in good health, and he's got all kinds of skills that are saleable. So I think he probably settles in England. Maybe we'll find out. Okay, so where would he have gone? Open to interpretation. When I was there, I also went up to William Penn's grave in a place called Jordan's Meeting. There it is next to he's buried with his second wife. His first wife had died. That was kind of interesting. And the town, little village around where he's buried at this meeting house, probably hasn't changed in 200 years from what I can see. And that's that. So, now I'll shut up. So, questions? Come on.
Fascinating.
None? And I was talking to Dave before this about stuff that Monmouth County has, art history. And this is surface stuff. I mean, there's a lot more about not only Yaf, but what I personally believe, and I can't prove it yet, up the road a piece is the Pinebrook community.
Mm-hmm.
I think that over time, enslaved people's descendants settled there because that was a historically black community. Okay, and no one that I know who lives there or friends of mine have identified yet their relatives there. But it just makes sense that over the next couple hundred years, as people are manumitted or whatever, they're going to settle locally. Why would they do that, by the way? If you're a slave and you run away, or later on in the 19th century period, why would you stay locally?
Job. Family.
Family. What else? Job.
Job.
Where are you going to go? You don't have anything. You've been deprived of property and life and livelihoods and everything else. And so sometimes people will tell you, well, the slaves must have been happy they stayed in their old master's property when they were free. That's a bunch of bunk. Where are they going to go?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, it's economics, and that's continued through the lack of generational wealth that black people in this country have, on average, been not able to build because they weren't allowed to. So that I've got to believe happened here, because over time, Lewis Morris and his descendants had more than just 60 slaves here. They were running. Eventually, this is a 6,400-acre piece of property, and the Morris family's not doing the work. So those people went somewhere, and it remains to be seen, and maybe we'll find out. Other questions?
I have one question.
Yes.
I've lived here 50 years, and I was always told that Tinton Falls, Shrewsbury, Redland was all part of the Middletown purchase. that it took up the whole section. We were part of Middletown.
No.
At one, early
Okay,
years.
so what really happened was, in the early days of the state, before it was a state, Shrewsbury was a separate borough. That was from including Red Bank. Red Bank runs the trade south, all the way down to Little Lake Harbor, by the way.
Wow.
And Middletown was north of the Navigant and also into this area. Okay, and you also had Freehold, you had Elizabeth up north. So no, Red Bank was never part of Middletown.
But was Tinton Falls was part of Shrewsbury, the Shrewsbury
Yeah,
parcel?
yes. But remember, borders were flexible in those days. When you show up and you take over,
Yeah.
they're not putting up they do put up fences eventually, but not right away. So that's a really good question. Anybody else? So I've got copies of the book, or they have them here at the museum, which I would love to sign for you, because the book that I wrote about not only this, but enslavement in New Jersey, and it's just a scratch of the surface of it. I try to get stories from all over New Jersey, and it's horrendous. I'm still surprised when I come across some of these things that were forced on black people. It's just, and last thing, Linda, I'm sorry. Don't let anybody ever tell you that the people that owned slaves in the North were nicer to their slaves than the people down South. By the nature of enslavement, it's nasty. And they did all the nasty things, including raping the women who were enslaved, because that's where you get free slaves. Do I know that Lewis Morris did that? No, I do not. But I know that other people did, so, roll the dice and think what you think. But slavery up here was as brutal as it was anywhere else. And it took us, as a state, to be the last in the North to finally say, okay, we'll go along with this. So that's that story. Okay, thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Chris.